Good morning. My name's Paul Wheatley-Price, and one of my interests is I like to read about history. And over the past couple of months, I've been wondering about characters from history, Christians in history, who have acted compassionately, sacrificially in the face of pandemic or plague or outbreaks of infectious diseases, and what we can learn about them, what we can learn from them, and take to ourselves. So I'm just going to share some slides, and then what I'd like to do is tell you about some of these characters. And so firstly, Florence Nightingale. So Florence Nightingale is a name well known to us, and it's relevant because earlier this month was International Nursing Week, runs from the 6th to the 12th of May each year. And the 12th of May is her birthday. And in fact, this year is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale in 1820. So she cut her teeth as a superintendent of a healthcare facility in London during an outbreak of cholera. And then she really made her name by setting up a field hospital in the Crimea during the Crimean War, where at that time, 10 times as many soldiers were dying of disease such as dysentery, typhus, cholera, than were actually dying of battle wounds. And so she introduced a number of practices in the field hospital, some very simple hygiene practices such as hand washing. And it's claimed that by doing those initiatives, implementing those initiatives, the death rate in the camps fell from 42% down to 2%. After the war, back in the UK, she had many accomplishments. She founded the Nightingale Nursing School at St. Thomas's Hospital, which more famous recently is the place where the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was treated for the coronavirus. She wrote nursing textbooks. She introduced nursing into the poorhouses that was such a feature of Victorian life. Her work influenced the Union Army healthcare policies during the American Civil War. Less well known, she was a very gifted mathematician and pioneered some of the graphical display of medical statistics, which are things that we've become very familiar with in recent months. And on this slide, there's an example of how she illustrated death rates in the Crimean War from different causes, and the blue is sort of infectious diseases, and you can see that over time that she was able to gradually reduce that. And then Nightingale became the first elected female member of the Royal Statistical Society. So I wondered, what was her motivation? Why was she driven throughout her life to do this? She was an Anglican, influenced by Wesleyan traditions. In fact, she got her early nursing training at a Lutheran community in Germany. And a few months before her 17th birthday, she wrote in her diary what's now really been referenced many times as her calling and the sentiment that motivated her through life. And I'll just read it to you. She wrote, "God called me in the morning and asked me, would I do good for him alone without reputation?" So her work, influential work throughout the world, was at the outpouring of her faith and her spiritual calling. Now, the calling of Christians to minister to the sick, of course, comes directly from the gospel, from Jesus's words in Matthew 25. And in here, we're reminded of the need to visit and care for the sick. And Jesus himself, of course, healed in this story, the 10 infected with leprosy. So that was really a stigmatized disease then and now that led to those afflicted being shunned and excluded from society. In the early church, there were a couple of major plagues that hit the Roman Empire, were thought to have been carried around the Roman Empire by Roman soldiers moving. There was the Antonine plague and then the Cyprian plague. And they killed up to maybe a quarter or even a third of the Roman population in some areas of the empire. So the Antonine plague from 165 to 180 AD resulted in an economic depression because there was a reduced workforce, less travel, less trade, fewer taxes. The plague even was possibly the cause of death of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The numbers in the Roman army were depleted. A lot of new recruits came in, which led to an relatively untrained army and some historic defeats in battle for the Roman army. But this period also saw the reputation of Christians becoming enhanced, because they were among the few who would minister to the sick, who would care for the victims of plague. About 3/4 of a century later, the Cyprian plague from 249 to 262 had similar impacts. Now, while smallpox is felt to have been the cause of the Antonine plague, the Cyprian plague may be smallpox, maybe even Ebola virus. And Bishop Dionysius of Alexandria, he wrote of the work of Christians through the Cyprian plague, through the time of the Cyprian plague. And I'll read you what he wrote. Most of our brethren were unsparing in their exceeding love and brotherly kindness. They held fast to each other and visited the sick fearlessly and ministered to them continually, serving them in Christ. And they died with them most joyfully, taking the affliction of others and drawing the sickness from their neighbors to themselves and willingly receiving their pains. And many who cared for the sick and gave strength to others died themselves, having transferred to themselves their death. And maybe it's in part because of the caring and the sacrifice of Christians during these times that they evolved from being just sort of a sect in Roman society, going into these plagues, to sort of coming out of it. And by 313 AD, they became the official religion of Rome. Is that kind of behavior reckless? No, of course not. Would we do it the same way now as those early Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century? No, of course not. Science has taught us about viruses and bacteria and transmission, and it's led us to learning about social distancing and personal protective equipment, such that we can now minister to the sick much more safely. Actually, elements of this were actually discussed by none other than Martin Luther. So in 1527, the bubonic plague reached Wittenberg in Germany, where Luther lived, and he published a pamphlet, and it was titled "Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague." And it's a document full of practical advice, including protection of medical staff. And in one paragraph, Luther kind of calls for 16th century social distancing, where he will help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed, in order to not become contaminated and thus perchance infect and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. And Luther goes on to say, if God should wish to take me, he will surely find me, and I have done what he has expected of me, and so I'm not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but will go freely. So what does Luther teach us about pandemic times? Well, follow the regulations, but also recognize the need to put the love of neighbor first. And Luther ends with this: see, this is such a God-fearing faith because it's neither brash nor foolhardy and does not tempt God. So the teachings of Jesus in Matthew 25 of caring for the sick are seen in actions by Christians throughout the centuries. As you're listening to this, think about how you and your communities, your church, your workplace, your neighborhood, your extended family, how can you demonstrate the love of Christ by helping those in need? Maybe something as simple as a phone call, grocery run, mowing the lawn. Jesus said, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Thanks.